Hello, everyone. Welcome into another episode of Bolt Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. My name is Alex, as always, and we are here with a special guest, ESPN's Matt Miller, here to talk draft, here to talk top 50 mocks. It's that season again. Now that the real football season has ended, it's time for everyone else to get into Matt's world of what he does full time with all the draft and stuff. And I'll start with this, Matt. How do you feel, watching the Super Bowl, the average draft position of all the defensive tackles in this class, maybe maybe cranking up a little bit?
It went up for sure. The defensive tackles, the defensive ends. And I think if you're a free agent offensive tackle right now in the NFL, you're probably feeling pretty good as well about the market that teams like Philadelphia have certainly created for you. So it's cool. And this, like this draft class lines up so well with the narrative coming out of the Super Bowl of, okay, how do you beat Kansas City? Well, you rush with four and you play with great play over the top. And so this draft class lines up so well with that. It's going to be fun to see how teams, especially teams, in the AFC West, try and build to match that model that Philadelphia put out there.
Yeah, obviously Philadelphia's model is very, one of the best in the NFL with all the guys they have there with Carter and Milton Williams and Josh Sweat, some of the guys they'll have hitting free agency, obviously, too. Where do you think, as far as defensive tackle edge, that the Chargers could kind of go in this draft, whether first round, later, to kind of address that need? Obviously, Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa up in the air with what they want to do there. Poona Ford maybe coming back, maybe not, hitting unrestricted free agency. So where do you kind of think the direction is for them to go in this draft before, free agency and knowing all that?
Yeah, hopefully my guy Poona Ford is back. He's one of my favorite players. So as a lifelong Texas fan, I need Poona back with the Chargers. I've heard good things. I've heard they want him back. So fingers crossed. I'm not Schefter. I'm not going to break any news, but I've heard good things that they want him back. So that'd be great. I do think that, one thing with this new regime is, and we saw last year, like Joe Alt was not only a best player available pick, it was a position in need. So, and, same with Lab McConkey. So right now it's like, we don't really know what the draft philosophy of this team is. Is it more need-based? Is it more value-based? Just because last year, those two things met perfectly with those early picks. So I think we're looking at the edge rushers with the D tackle. This draft class is so deep at those two spots that we might be in a similar spot when the Chargers come up late first round of, okay, like if they take a defensive end, is it just because that was the best player available, or does it say something about the way they want to construct the roster? So, excuse me, that's what I think will be a lot of fun to see. Khalil Mack had a great year, by the way. Like, not just Poona. Khalil Mack had a great year.
Right.
And it's tough to, remember that he's an older player because of the year that he had. And so I do, when I first sketched out my team needs for the Chargers, it was like wide receiver, tight end. And then it was like, gosh, just value in the trenches, because you do have some older guys, even if Khalil is back. With Bosa's contract, I think that's going to be like a year-to-year conversation. It certainly has been the last two off seasons. So it's like after you kind of figure out what you want to do at wide receiver and tight end, it feels like with the rest of those picks, it almost makes sense to just go to the trenches and try to build that way. And especially that's such a Jim Harbaugh thing to want to do, is to build through the trenches. So this is a good draft class to line up with where the Chargers are at needs wise as well.
Yeah, it was a weird experience last offseason because Field Yates and all the great people at ESPN were kind of clamoring. It's like, Joe Alt's going to be the pick. Joe Alt's going to be the pick. The fan base at the time did not like that and wanting a Marvin Harrison or Malik Neighbors, but they built through the trenches, and hard to argue with the Alt pick to this point. Obviously, the Texans game showed they still need to add on that offensive line and still need to add at wide receiver. What's kind of your feeling about where they could add at offense sort of first in this draft around where they are?
Yeah, I mean, I think at pick 22, this is not a great receiver draft. And I know Charger fans don't want to hear that. And there's going to be players. Like, you're going to find guys, right? Somebody's going to pop. Right. But at pick 22, you're kind of hoping someone falls, because there's not that great end of round one, like Brian Thomas Jr. There's not that guy in this draft where you're like, okay, we'll be all right in the 20s. We'll still be able to get a dude. Travis Hunter is going to go really, really early. After him, there's a conversation about Tedero McMillan at Arizona. Is he a fit for everyone? Because he's 6'5" and he's got this great catch radius, but he's not incredibly fast. Luther Burden, Missouri did him no favors this past year with the play calling and the scheme and the struggles they had at quarterback. But if you go back to 2023, he looks like a top 5 player in the draft. Matthew Golden from Texas had a great year. Emeka Egbuka is just a really good all-around football player. I feel like those wide receivers are first-round picks. One of them could absolutely be there at 22. And then at tight end, like you have, I think the dream fit is, and I know it's just the Michigan connection probably, but like Loveland is the dream fit here. He really is. That's what he does, as an up the seam option, what he could be over the middle. Like it just opens so much up. And he is a good blocker in the run game. He was hurt this past year, so he was held back a little bit. I think a lot of people are sleeping on him right now. I have him in my top 12 players overall. Like I'm in love with his game if you go back to 2023 when he was healthy. So I do think like, the Chargers are stacked with draft picks. That's something to remember. It's like you can get a lot of offense in this draft. With 4 picks in the top 125, you're probably going to need to spend one of those on a defensive lineman, but you could come out of this with, a wide receiver, a tight end, and a running back if you want to, if J.K. Dobbins isn't back in free agency, and not only reshape this offense, but doing it with young players who are inexpensive and are going to allow you to spend some money elsewhere.
You had maybe even more of a dream fit for the Chargers in your most recent mock draft, where you did have them taking Ashton Jeanty at 22, excuse me. And then you had Mason Taylor from LSU in the second round. What kind of went into your thought process there? Not that like you have to really explain Ashton Jeanty to people and why he's good,
right?
But
him,
not that you have to sell people, but for the Chargers to take it back that early and somebody that fits the Harbaugh system.
Yeah, I think running backs and tight ends are the 2 hardest positions for us to slot in mock drafts. Even last year with Brock Bowers, it was like this is a top 10 player, but where do you put him? Because positional value and team need. A lot of teams aren't going to take a tight end that early. Running back is the same. Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, great players. They were really hard to put in mock drafts because you're basically betting on a team going away from conventional wisdom and saying we're going to draft a non-premium position early because the player is just really, really good. So with Jeanty this year in this mock, it was like that too. I could see him going 6 to the Raiders, 7 to the Jets. Like he could go really, really early. But then you kind of get to that point of like, well, those teams are probably going to go premium positions, quarterbacks, wide receivers, offensive tackles. And so then you have a little bit of a slide for him. And it was like, Denver has needs across the board. I don't know if Sean Payton is certain, let's spend a first-round pick on a running back guy. But I think Jim Harbaugh would be. Let's spend a first round on a running back, especially one who's such a good fit for the scheme. You've seen him throughout college. He's been very, very good as a receiver at times. I mean, his contact balance is unreal. He's so good between the tackles. He's so powerful, but he has runaway speed. And it's like you could solve the running back position for the next, 6 years between a rookie contract and a franchise tag off of one pick. And that's like hard to bypass. So it's a deep running back class. And like, that's kind of the conversation I have with myself when I'm doing mock drafts is, okay, well, if they don't take one at 22, even though he's the best player on the board by like 15 picks at this point, if you don't take one at 22, when you come back at 55, who's going to be there? Because I think we're going to see a run on backs at the top of round 2. So it's like you put yourself in the chair of the GM for all these teams. It's like, okay, if we take a tight end at 22, for example, can we get a running back at 55, or can we get a wide receiver at 55, or what's going to be there at 86 in the third round? So it was like, no, I think you take the best player available who's at a position of need. And we saw this year what a great running back can do when you already have a great quarterback. Like Philly is a great example of that. I mean, even what Josh Jacobs did, what Derrick Henry did. So it's like, let's give Justin Herbert that. Let's just solve the running back question for the next 5 or 6 years with Ashton Jeanty.
Yeah. And unlike, those other guys, you don't have to pay Ashton Jeanty in the same way that you would a Saquon or a Josh Jacobs or Derrick Henry.
He's cheap.
On the market.
Yeah.
With the rookie contract. If Jeanty is off the board, I know you wrote about kind of his fit in the Harbaugh Roman run scheme. Who are some of the other names rounds 2 through round 7, whomever that you kind of like as a fit for what the Chargers do?
Man, there are so many running backs in this draft that it's like we could spend we have 30 minutes together. We could spend the whole time talking about running backs. It's that good of a class. So like in the mindset of like I always think when I think about Jim Harbaugh, and this probably isn't fair, I'm always like I think about Frank Gore and like that. I want that type of running back, and I think even like J.K. Dobbins has some of those same qualities. So like if Ashton Jeanty's not there in round 2, Quinshon Judkins from Ohio State would be awesome. If you guys are okay with an Ohio State, player playing for a Michigan head coach,
They already have that with
yeah,
Dobbins. So I mean,
exactly. Right, exactly. So it's fine. Yeah. So Judkins would be awesome in that role. Caleb Johnson from Iowa is being slept on for some reason. I think he would be awesome in that role. He hasn't been a great receiver out of the backfield, so you would need to pair him with somebody, who can play that role. He would be great there. Cam Scatabo is I have a 4th round grade on him, but I think if you were just going to draft somebody to just go be a bulldozer and just be a sledgehammer, you would draft him. Same with Damian Martinez from Miami. I think he'd be a really, really good fit. Jordan James from Oregon is probably in that late round 3, early round 4 conversation. Devin Neal from Kansas would be in there for me as well. So, I mean, truly, like, I think I have a draftable grade on over 30 running backs right now. It's ridiculous how many running backs there are in this class that are worthy of being drafted. And it's great because like the Chargers have 11 picks or 10 or 11 picks, right? So it's
I think it'll be 10 after comp picks or
after comp picks
and all that stuff.
So like, I mean, if you don't take one at 22 or you don't take one at 55, it's like, I mean, I could find you a starter in the 4th round in this draft. It's just that good at the running back position.
Yeah, Cam Scatabo specifically is the first team all guy Harbaugh would watch on all 22 and like be pumped up to take. I feel like out of that group of names you kind of mentioned. Going into the defensive side of the ball now, we talked a little bit about defensive tackle, but tell me kind of who are some of the defensive fits that you really like for Jesse Minter heading into year 2 of this scheme, just guys that you think they could bring in at any point in this draft that would fit?
The obvious one's Kenneth Grant, right? And again, there's the Michigan connection, but also it's like if you lose Poona Ford, you need that anchor. And Kenneth Grant is that. And it's funny because he's like almost the polar opposite of Poona because he's 6'5", 250 pounds instead of, 5'11" and 320 pounds. So I think Kenneth Grant would be a good fit. Tyleik Williams from Ohio State would give you some of that same ability, with the leverage play. He's 322 pounds, so he's going to be able to, he could be a 0 or a 1 technique. He can play up front and control things. Alfred Collins from Texas would be another good one. Collins is a lot of fun because he was behind Byron Murphy. He was behind T'Vondre Sweat. They've had such a good run of defensive tackles at Texas that he's had 1 year of playing a lot of reps. And it was so cool to watch him just get better over the course of the season. And now it's to the point of like, gosh, what's going to happen for this guy once he gets another season of reps, of just being a starter, being in there every day, learning how to use his tools. So when you watch him, you think, it's not a huge pass rush profile with this guy, but he has the athletic ability. He just hasn't really been unlocked to go be a pass rusher yet. So I'm anxious to see like what's next for him. I think he could be one of those guys that ends up being just a better pro, like a more all-around pro than he was in college, where he was more of a true run defender. Another one that I love is Darius Alexander from Toledo. And he had a huge Senior Bowl week. He showed a lot of versatility. He fits more of like the type of players they kind of went for when Harbaugh was in San Francisco up front with, big guys who could play defensive end or they can kick inside and play defensive tackle. So I do think that he would be a fit and he maybe has made himself enough money that he's going to be a late round 2 pick at this point. So that might be a little rich for the Chargers, but there's really good defensive tackle depth in this draft.
Speaking of Senior Bowl and Shrine Bowl and all those kind of college all-star game events, who are some of the guys that you think went stock up? I mean, I feel like the big ones that people know are kind of Mike Green, obviously, some of the other defensive tackles, edge players. Who were some of the guys that stuck out to you?
Mike Green had a huge week. It really, truly did. I mean, and I think everyone's seen the clip of him running over Josh Connerly. I mean, that's
unfortunately for Josh Connerly.
And I love Josh Connerly, so that was so hard for it. It's like you want to like jump on Twitter and be like, Connerly held his own every other rep, but it's like, no, it doesn't matter because there's that clip of him, getting ran over by Mike Green. So Green had a great week. Gray Zabel, the interior offensive line from North Dakota State, had a great week as well. Elijah Arroyo from Miami, the tight end, who could be I think he probably goes in between the Chargers picks between 22 and 55. He had a great week as well. As Thomas, the corner from Florida State, had a great week. Quincy Riley, the corner from Louisville, had a great week. And like, I know I'm forgetting guys, but the D-line group was awesome. And I think we saw that. Just Shamar Stewart had 2 days of practice where you were like, oh, that's why people like this guy who's had 4.5 sacks the last 3 seasons. But you look at the tools and it's like, my goodness, there's so much here to work with. So it was a great week to be a defensive end. And like on the other side of that, like you mentioned, I know the Chargers are really, really good at offensive tackle right now. It was a rough week for the Senior Bowl offensive tackles just because you're going against, it's like you didn't get a rep off. Every single rep was, okay, it feels like I'm going against a guy who's going to be a top 50 pick. It's just wave after wave of great players.
Yeah, you mentioned as Thomas, and the Chargers just hired Adam Fuller, who was the safeties coach, was the defensive coordinator at Florida State, who now is becoming the safeties coach with the Chargers. So you kind of wonder if that's a potential connection with the big week that he had at the Senior Bowl. And yeah, adding in the trenches for sure at D tackle, like you mentioned. This wide receiver offseason, I think, is interesting for the Chargers, not necessarily in terms of this draft class specifically, but you've had people like Jeremy Fowler link the Chargers to DK Metcalf, link the Chargers to Devontae Adams, some of these big wide receiver moves. How kind of would you go about the Chargers offseason between adding, someone premium or someone, supplementary in free agency and balancing that kind of with this wide receiver talent in the draft?
Yeah, I think it's tough because you look at some of the moves that teams have made, in that similar mold of like Buffalo gets Stephon Diggs and they get close, but they don't get over the hump, right? But then Philly adds AJ Brown and look what that's done for them. So it's tough because I think there are arguments on each side of like, what's the best way to build your wide receiver room? If I had Justin Herbert and you're picking at 22, I would be more inclined to make a move for a DK Metcalf or a Devontae Adams. I think they're one of the few teams where it's like, hey, we got to take a swing at this thing because we've got this great quarterback. And so from that standpoint, I think it makes sense. T. Higgins is probably in that same group as well, where he's a great number 2 receiver. Is he going to be a good number 1? Like maybe, it's worth taking that shot because you have such an established quarterback and you have the established offensive tackles. So I think you could at least have that conversation. And again, like, I think the worry, if you're the Chargers, is will the wide receiver board be wiped off at 22? It's like by the time we get to 22, Travis Hunter's gone for sure. Ted McMillan, gone. Like Burden, Golden, Ibuka could be gone. And so you get to that spot of like, okay, our board is wiped out. And maybe Tyler Warren and Colston Loveland are gone as well. So it's like, all right, what do we do? Like, how do we help Justin now when our board's been wiped out? You're probably drafting a guy on defense in that spot. So I think that's where, as pivotal as finding that true number 1 receiver is for them this offseason, I think you got to at least look under those rocks and see like, okay, what would DK cost or what would Devontae cost us in terms of draft capital? And then, what does the contract look like over the next 2 years? I think you got to have that conversation just because they're proven playmakers. But I think like this year's trade deadline, to watch DeAndre Hopkins go to Kansas City and do nothing, or Amari Cooper go to Buffalo and did nothing, like that would give me a lot of pause. Like if I'm Joe Ortiz and Harbaugh, it's like, gosh, there's a lot of buyer beware out there. And so you've got to really make sure that you know what you're getting health wise and that you're getting those guys to where they can come in and acclimate and learn. Because I think what you don't want to do is it to be week 8 next season and you're like, okay, gosh, we got to make a trade for a 31-year-old receiver because we're kind of limping our way into the postseason without a certified number 1 receiver. So I know that's like a lot of hedging, but I think you have to at least explore getting that premier number 1 receiver that can help you for the next 2 years as you try to draft and develop somebody to fill that role.
Right. I feel like this season for the Chargers specifically was kind of, they weren't, one of the true contender teams, right? They, would buy at the deadline if there was like a deal for them, but there wasn't that wide receiver addition that truly became available. They poked around on Deontay Johnson and tried to claim him.
Yep.
But, ultimately they didn't end up making a move in that regard, which hurt them in the playoff game. But this was also kind of year 1 of the rebuild with everything they did last year. So it was kind of no harm, no foul in that way. Versus, I do think, like you said, wide receiver has some pretty important stakes for them. And then, like you mentioned, I do think it's kind of funny that Philadelphia has become they built through the trenches team, but meanwhile, Howie Roseman has spent a first-round pick on A.J. Brown, a first-round pick on Devontae Smith, and a third-round pick to trade up for him after a first-round miss on Jalen Reagor in 2020. So that's like 3 first-round picks in a row on wide receiver, for the guy that builds through the trenches, which both things are true. But it's interesting how that got discussed after the Super Bowl.
Yeah, and it helps when you find a quarterback at pick 51, right? Like that makes it easier when you can spend in the trenches, or when you could trade Carson Wentz for what they traded Carson Wentz for. It is fascinating how some of your like misses become hits because you're able to move on from guys, and it allows you to pretty quickly rebuild.
I wanted to go through your top 50. Who's maybe a player you're higher on than the average, and maybe a player you're a little bit lower on than the average?
Yeah, it's funny. I actually just turned in my updated top 50 to my editor today. So it will come out, I believe, next week. And so I have like that in my mind right now. Like, okay, who am I really high on? So I'm really high on Jahdae Barron, the corner from Texas. And I don't know, I mentioned this on social media that I'm kind of trying to remind myself to go back to like the roots of my philosophy of evaluating football players, which is draft good football players. Like we get so caught up in data points like age and 40 time and 3-cone and, GPS miles per hour and all the analytics that can help us do our job. But at the end of the day, like you should be drafting good football players. And so when I look at like Jahdae Barron and Colston Loveland, I'm probably going to be higher on them than my colleagues at ESPN. But like, that's how I would explain it. It's like, guys, I look at what the Rams, the Eagles, the Chargers, the Chiefs, like the teams that have been really, really good over the past 5 years, is they're just drafting ready-made football players who are high character, that they've come from big time programs where they had big production. And I know that sounds like really simple, but we forget that. It's how like Travon Walker goes first overall instead of Aiden Hutchinson,
right.
And it's going to happen again this year. Guys are going to get floated up. So I would say like that's on the flip side, guys I'm lower on. Like I'm pretty low on Shamar Stewart just because he averaged 1.5 sacks over the last 3 years. It's very, very rare that a guy's going to not produce in college and then produces in the NFL. And I like Chop Robinson did it this past year for the Dolphins after not having a sack at Penn State the year before, which is just mind-boggling. But I'm going to like generally, we evaluate 700 players a year. There's going to be misses, but I'm generally going to go with that idea of like big time players need to make big time plays. And if you didn't produce in college, I got to know why. Like what happened? Were you buried on the depth chart? Were you hurt? Like what was it? And so I think I'll be lower on Stewart than some of my counterparts will be. I'm really low on the quarterback class. Like I don't have Jalen Milroe in my top 100 right now. And I still see him in the second round of mock drafts. And I don't see it. I hope I'm wrong because he's a great person. But as of now, and having just watched him at the Senior Bowl, I didn't think he was good enough to be drafted in the first, second, or third round.
Yeah, I feel like that's also kind of a quarterback market inefficiency of this draft, which is just like, in last year's class, Jalen Milroe, might not get in the first 3 rounds, but now he's, kind of elevated because of what this quarterback class is around him. So getting into wrapping up here, if I had to put you on the spot right now in April, who's the Chargers pick at 22?
Oh gosh, I'll go Colston Loveland again. Like that's my guy. I absolutely love him, and I do think like realistically, Ashton Genty's going to be gone. Tyler Warren's going to be gone. So I'll go with Colston Loveland. I mean, he helps in the run game, but he automatically gives you another weapon. I think he and McConkey together would just beat folks up in the middle of the field. They're both going to be a lot of yards after catch opportunities, and then you got to find that field stretcher maybe in free agency. But to me, like when I watch him play, and I was at the Michigan Pro Day and got to hang out with him for the day, it's like that is a Jim Harbaugh player through and through. So I'll go with Loveland.
Yeah. Jim Harbaugh player through and through. We talked about him, and Kenneth Grant are kind of the offensive and defensive,
Yep.
top fits at 22, which is predictable with the Michigan thing, but it is what it is. I'll finish up on this. Who are some players that you're going to be watching for in terms of metrics and timing and all the things that we look for at the combine in a couple weeks that you're most intrigued to watch?
Yeah, hopefully we get people testing, right? I think the college football season going so long has put a lot of players behind the eight ball in terms of the timing for their testing. So one that I really want to see, Will Johnson, the corner from Michigan. Like, I think his testing time is really going to matter. He needs to be in the 4.4s is where he needs to be, because there are questions about speed. So that's going to be big. And then Luther Burden from Missouri. I think on the other side, he had a down year. You hear scouts say, and he might have gained too much weight to try to be more physical. How fast is he going to run? I really hope we get to see both those guys run at the combine, because like Xavier Worthy running the 40 last year, something I'll never forget. Like, being in the stands to watch that happen and to feel the energy in Lucas Oil, like, it was such an awesome moment. So I hope we actually do get guys who show up and compete and try to make a name for themselves, try to earn themselves some money. But I think those are the two that I kind of have circled of, like, I really want to see what they're able to do, because it's like for Will Johnson, it's the difference between being a top 10 pick and falling in the draft. Could be running a 40-yard dash 2 times. So there's a lot of pressure on it, but it will have a huge impact on the early portion of the draft.
Yeah, we'll have a huge, and again, another Harbaugh guy potentially there, and Will Johnson, who might have, a lot of money on the line with that combine appearance. So thanks to Matt for joining the show. And as always, bolt up and see you guys next time.